Southfacers, and is a very inspiring person to me. So we've only interacted briefly since I joined Southface, but as someone that I want to get to know more, I want to work closely with, I want to understand what she's doing because, you know, like Southface as an organization, she is certainly a thought leader, an innovator, someone who is really making a big impact in the world. And we want to learn from you today. We want to have some dialogue with you. But for those of you that don't know Lindsay, she is currently the CEO of the International Living Future Institute. She's based in Oakland. The organization's formerly in the Bullitt Center in Seattle. They've got an outstanding conference coming up in a few weeks in Washington, D.C. But she has been with really small, unimportant organizations like the U.S. Green Building Council as part of the first team. She's worked with a really small office place called WeWork. She's just really been involved. She's a fellow at RMI. She is a lecturer at UC Berkeley. She just does so many cool things and has started a lot of things, but I'm going to turn it over to her at this point. But former Southfacer, Lindsay Baker, take it away.
Thank you. Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. So nice to see that. See Liz York is on. This is delightful. I have to take a moment before I'm going to share some slides and maybe just talk a little bit before we have a dialogue. I feel like this group, I would love to just have a conversation with you all and talk about whatever is on your minds or whatever you're curious about that's happening with living buildings or otherwise in the movement. But before I do that, I just want to give my sincerest gratitude to the Southface community, just to start off. And maybe for those of you who might be newer to the community, I just want to make sure you know how fortunate you are to get to be a part of that place. I started as an intern at Southface when I was 18. I had just learned about green buildings in an AP environmental science class at Paideia School, and I wanted to get into it. I was really excited about it. I decided to go to Oberlin College in Ohio to study it, and a friend of our family's, Dr. Howard Frumpkin, knew Dennis and was very kind. I was very fortunate, very fortunate that how he somehow got me in there. And Southface, when I showed up, I came to understand that I was probably the youngest intern that had been able to work there at that point. And at that time, this was the year 2000, my parents were very worried about this idea that I wanted to work in green building because they just thought there wasn't going to be any jobs in it. And, that it was kind of a fantasy. And lo and behold, the movement and the whole industry really has taken off in the past 23 years. And I remember my first day at Southface, I think it was Mike A, said, well, what do you want to focus on here? And I said, well, green buildings. Like, I'm here to focus on green buildings. That's as far as I've gotten. And in retrospect, it was a bold question to ask an 18-year-old, like, which facet of the work? But it was such an incredible place to really understand the breadth and depth of sustainability and regeneration in buildings and cities. And just so thankful for all the time that I got to spend there, because I think it helped me understand how important technical rigor is to the work, how important community connection is to the work, how important being in a space that kind of shows what that example feels like is to the work. So it's just really grounded me in my career, and I just appreciate it a lot. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me. What I did today was that I just brought up a few slides because I thought that for you all, what might be interesting and relevant was to kind of talk about what I'm up to these days with living buildings and the Living Future Institute. So I thought I would just kind of show you where we are in this particular facet of the movement. I guess I'll say the last bit of my introduction here is that my career, as James mentioned, has kind of been interestingly all over the place. And I don't know if you all have ever wondered about that, for those of you that have known me since the early years, but I've always been focused on the idea of levers for change, levers for disproportionate change in the building industry, looking for what those would be. So I started a tech company with some folks, and we did that for a few years, and that was successful, but not really as big of a lever as I wanted it to be. As James mentioned, I worked at WeWork, so sort of always trying to think about this question of what is it going to look like to really transform the entire building industry around regenerative principles. And that journey brought me here. About a year and a half ago, I joined the Living Future Institute as the CEO. The organization's been around for a little over a decade. I'm sure many of you know that and may know a little bit about our history. But I'm going to just kind of give you at least the basics so that we're all on the same page. And I thought it would be nice to kind of share where I think the Institute is and how sort of the idea of a living building has evolved over the past decade, and what we think is next, and sort of, I guess, maybe also where we think we fit in the larger movement around regenerative and green buildings. Because sometimes I think I get the question, I'm sure that some of you all have this question or have thought about it before. There's probably around 30 living buildings in the world. I think a journalist actually asked me the other day, does it make you feel bad that there are so many more LEED buildings in the world than there are living buildings? Like, do you have a sense of competition about that? And I was thinking, well, of course I have this sense that we should be building, like that I'm impatient for the economy and for our ways of building to change more rapidly than they have. But that's not the idea behind the Living Building Challenge, to somehow, lower the bar until everybody can get to it in order to be able to say that we've got lots of living buildings. But I thought it might be helpful to kind of articulate what that theory of change is, so we can talk about it and you all might have a chance to ask questions. So with that, I'm happy to say that at this point, probably at this maybe 12 or so years into the Living Building Challenge, we have living buildings all over the world and in all different building types, and in the sort of major climate zones as well, especially of North America, but also of some of the more diverse climate zones around the world. And there's this wonderful diversity of buildings that are sometimes pretty low tech and sometimes pretty high tech, and showing that both are possible, and that all of these building types are possible is really a big part of who we want to be and why we exist in the world, in the movement. And yet I pulled this from Architecture 2030. I imagine some of you all have seen this graphic before. With global building floor area expected to double in the coming years, the challenge that we're facing to actually shift the way that we build fundamentally across the planet, to me, is still sort of the challenge that we need to focus our attention on. So as much as we're proud of having a set of really outstanding buildings, the question is, how does that sort of relate to this challenge that we are that we are rising to collectively as a community? And of course, it's not climate change, as Architecture 2030 focuses on, but increasingly, I don't know how you all feel about in Atlanta, but for us here in California, climate emergency days are becoming more and more frequent for us, whether it's floods where people can't get out of their neighborhood, or the wildfires that have such a negative impact on all of our health. We are experiencing the severity of climate change and how deeply buildings are impacting our lives and our health every day. And I should also say housing insecurity is a major issue that I think sometimes we in the sustainable buildings movement have probably thought about the idea of like real estate and economic dynamics as being somehow out of scope for us, but we don't feel that way. At the Institute, we try to think about the ways in which buildings are really shifting, and have the ability for people for us to share wealth rather than to hoard it. So buildings have all of these roles in our lives that we have to pay attention to, and then that allow us to have positive impacts, but also right now in our world oftentimes are contributing to some pretty negative cycles. So at the Institute, the work that we're doing with the Living Building Challenge and our other programs, in many ways, is to try to inspire a different way of seeing the world. That's the challenge that we rise to every day, is to envision a different future and then help people articulate a way to get to that. And I think that's why we tend to feel like we're always at the vanguard, more or less, of our communities, because we're kind of trying to ask that question: what is it going to look like when we've gotten to the world that we think we need to sustain ourselves? Another way people have typically imagined it, and this graph is kind of hilariously old, and the colors are, you can kind of tell what era it was from, but we do focus on regenerative. So when I use the term regenerative in this context, it's to say that we are aiming for buildings that have a positive impact on the world in climate, health, and equity as sort of metrics of success, rather than just getting to that point of sustainable. And that so that is still our focus and the kinds of projects that we work together with our project teams on. We could take a lot of inspiration from Buckminster Fuller. So the idea of making the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time. I like this one in particular because I guess I'll just say, when I started at Southface, and I think you all have evolved as a community then in the way that I did professionally over the past 20 years, it can be hard to define a goal that is more than just environmental, but that is really incorporating society, economics, human thriving. And I like the way that he puts this, because it sort of does a nice job of an intersectional goal, if you will, of what we're all trying to aim for. Just a few numbers to give you a sense of where we are as an organization. So we have a lot of different programs now and a lot of different clients that we work with all over the country and the world. I like to think about our work as being sort of in three different spheres of influence. So the first is the design and construction and operation of buildings. The second is the design and fabrication of building materials. And the third is in the operation of organizations in the building industry. So what we've decided to do is it's a hypothesis or a theory of change for the organization, is that if we can shift practice and provide sort of the ambitious goals for climate, health, and equity in these three areas, there's kind of a 3x3 matrix that we've been working on to show what it looks like to sort of redefine what good looks like in all three of these areas, that we might be able to shift the building industry. So this is sort of the nitty-gritty of how we're doing it. I'm really proud of the kind of clients that we work with. I will say I put all these logos on this slide because I think it helps you understand the kinds of organizations that we work with today. In part because I don't know if this is you all, but before I joined ILFI, I kind of thought that it was still this organization that was just like helping some, cool straw bale folks building single family homes and, outside of Portland, Oregon or something, which is cool. And we do that, but also, increasingly what the kind of vanguard of the building industry looks like is, the Googles and Microsofts and other kinds of companies, Harvard for sure, that are trying to scale this and have really ambitious health metrics for themselves, ambitious climate goals, that kind of thing. So it's I think we've grown up in a nice way and really proud of what we're doing. I won't go into too much detail in any one of these programs, but feel free. Oh, no, it looks like we've got there's a question in the chat. Oh yeah, Buckminster Fuller. I think he did have a heart for environmental justice. I think that's right. I don't know that he would have framed it that way, but he was such a holistic thinker, right? And that's so much of what I think that intersectional approach is trying to do. So I also want to make the point that this gets to kind of the theory of certifications. And this, I mean, honestly, I'd be happy to talk with this group, until the end of the session about this question, which is that the Living Building Challenge was always initially created and still to this day functions not just as a certification program. It functions first and foremost as a philosophy, second as an advocacy tool, and finally as a certification program. And this may sound kind of just like sort of semantics or marketing language, but the reason that's important is a fewfold. One is it is not actually accessible to everybody, and we think that's okay. If it were just a pure certification program, and as you heard, I worked on LEED when it was first kind of getting solidified, and it was we really needed LEED to be created in such a way that any building could pursue it and potentially achieve it. And the focus was on trying to get as many buildings in any particular city to meet that standard as we possibly could. And that is still the theory of change for LEED, is to really encourage as many buildings to get into that program and get that certification, get them on the sort of path towards incremental improvement. The theory of change for the Living Building Challenge, and I think this is actually important for you all in Atlanta in particular, is to build some of these buildings across the world in different climate zones, as I said, different building types, et cetera, to use them as teaching tools, to use them as influencers of policy, to have folks walk through the buildings such that they understand and can imagine just how much more expansive our palette is in the way that we build. It's not, in fact, to try to get everybody to that point, literally. It's to really use them as inspirational tools. Or as my former professor at Oberlin would say, it's architecture as pedagogy. It's the idea that these buildings can change our minds. And so we're kind of at that point now in our evolution as an organization where, yes, we are seeing more living buildings come into the world, and that's exciting. And we support those buildings through the process of getting certified. But it's as much that than it really is for us, the practice of figuring out how to leverage these buildings for the greatest possible catalytic impact they can have in their communities. And that's sort of where the advocacy piece comes in as well. For those that are not as familiar with some of the aspects of the Living Building Challenge, and this is true of the Living Product Challenge and a lot of our work, we see the impact areas across these 7 petal categories that are similar to the categories of LEED. So again, a breadth of different issues that we address in the Living Building Challenge. This particular year, we're actually going to be working on a new revision to We're focused on some revisions around energy and carbon, as well as a revision to our product-focused systems declare and the Living Product Challenge. Next year, we're anticipating the Living Building Challenge 5.0 to come out, and it's going to have a number of updates, in particular to the equity petal and section there, which we're working on now. As a part of sort of some revisions on our JUST program. So there's going to be a lot more to I think we're going to be doing a lot of work in the next year, trying to have sort of equally robust descriptions of the goals around equity as we have around environment, which has been, kind of emphasized a bit more. This is a great question. Do you collect any data on policy change due to living building advocacy? Like, how do you measure? Yeah. It's a great question. We actually have started to look into that and we're starting to try to collect it, Allison. I'm happy to share a little bit more of what we're going to be doing there. I think in some ways, what we're aiming to do, some of our metrics will be things like how many people visit the buildings every year, that kind of thing. But then we'd also like to start, like for us, it's probably similar to you all, where we just have to track the question of how often we or a particular living building gets involved in a piece of advocacy work or a policy discussion at the local level. So it's not, we don't have perfect ways to measure it yet, but I will say one of the cool things that we can do is to codify it in the Living Building Challenge itself. So in the equity pedal, in LBC 5.0, there will be a more specific set of requirements around how to engage community during the design and construction of a building, during the operation of a building, and sort of other ways that we want to essentially ask people to use their buildings as levers for change. So it's going to be kind of literally baked into the program, which I'm excited about because I think it will help the Living Building Challenge be a little bit more progressive in a way, because now you can get a single family home certified, and it kind of just, you're the only one that really experiences it, and that's not really the idea here. That's not our theory of change. So we want to make sure that every building that does get the Living Building certification is really a pillar in its community. It's having impacts beyond just the folks that have the privilege of living in it every day. Oh, well, I thought I'm not going to talk too much about those two slides. That's more specific about our zero carbon program. Happy to go back to it if you'd like. But what I thought I would do, and then we'll just, we can have a conversation, is to just share a few of the stories. I've got 3 buildings here, and the Candida building is one, of how I think the Living Building Challenge has evolved over time. So one of the very first buildings, and the building that we've had our headquarters in for a number of years, that really kind of formed a lot of our attitudes about the Living Building Challenge, is the Bullitt Center in Seattle, really created by Dennis Hayes and the Bullitt Foundation, there as a office building, still one of the only living buildings that has leased office space. I'm sorry. And a lot of lessons have been learned in this building. A lot of they had to replace the composting toilet system at a point because it wasn't it was causing too many operational difficulties, let's say. But it's been in of itself showing what was possible from the perspective of a leased office building. Really, I think, broke a lot of boundaries for us as a movement to show that this was possible. Obviously, beautiful job with the interior circulation. They have this lovely stairwell, some great automated shades, and they're quite loud, I would say. The acoustics are not necessarily great in this building, but that was a good lesson learned early on. I like this little graphic because it just shows a little bit of the power of the Living Building Challenge as a goal. One of the things I think we are able to do is prove out this hypothesis that you hear in Silicon Valley, which is sometimes it takes as much effort to make a 10% improvement to something as it does to make a 10x improvement to that same thing. Because when you're thinking about how to change a system in such a fundamental way, and to grow it or to evolve it to 10x its capacity, it makes you ask different questions. And I think this is a good example of that, where the Bullitt Center was able to essentially reduce its energy use intensity so significantly that it could actually have this PV array on its roof that could supply all of the energy for the building from just this roof, which, that's a significant overhang, but it's still on there, and it's still net zero. And here we go. This is just a little bit more about the energy use intensity of the Bullitt Center, and what they were able to achieve there. And it's It's actually being sold right now. If anyone happens to know really progressive real estate owners in Seattle, please let them know that it needs a new steward as the Villa Foundation is winding down. So then the next is your building here, Southface West. Is that what you called it, James? In Atlanta, I think this is kind of the next evolution. First of all, I think it's a gorgeous building. It does a really good job with the beauty petal of the Living Building Challenge. There's also some sophistication in it that the earlier versions at the Bullitt Center didn't have. But, you know, as always, I think these buildings are learning from each other. I think one of the things that it's done really well is to incorporate sort of the place petal, or, you know, aspects of the landscape in a little bit more of a profound way that is really inspiring to a lot of folks. I'm also really impressed by what the Bullitt Center did. By what the Candida Center did on materials. I'm not sure how much you all know about this. I don't want to overemphasize it if you've all heard the stories, but we at the Institute have been really proud of the way that the Candida building thought about social equity in the ways that it was, you know, finding materials for the site. My understanding of this story, if you haven't heard it before, is that the building was reclaiming a bunch of wood and essentially found a job training program for formerly incarcerated folks to help to turn that reclaimed wood into some of the materials for the building. So just a really great impact and a good example, I think, for others. Sometimes folks have a little bit of a hard time understanding how it is that we understand social impact to be fundamental and very well integrated into the climate and sort of health goals of building and building. And this is just such a perfect example of where those things all kind of came together. And I won't dwell too much on these beautiful pictures because I know you get to go visit all the time, but it felt to me, I got to visit it a couple of years ago and just felt really like a nice, well-situated building, a living building that's managed some elegance and how it exists in the world. And again, brings in a lot of people every year to learn from its example. And I want to finish with this one. This is a building that's actually not quite certified yet, but this is the PAE Engineers headquarters building in Portland, Oregon. So just a completely different form and a fascinating one in many ways. But to me, I feel like this one is kind of helping to show that it is possible to build a pretty standard looking office building. They were quite restricted in their facade options by the fact that they're in a historic preservation district. You can kind of see what the other buildings look like there. So they had to do kind of this blocky thing that you're seeing, but just packed the solar panels on the roof. I mean, really, this is Paul Schwer, the president of PAE, up on the roof with me and just showing all of the ways in which they had to kind of squeeze these solar panels on the roof. I will say again, another great social impact story from this building is that they didn't actually, they could not get to net zero on their roof. And so they actually donated and installed some solar panels on a school building nearby. And what it's enabling them to do basically is to share some of that solar power with the public school in their neighborhood while still being able to meet the requirements of the Living Building Challenge. But they treated it as essentially a donation to the school. So the school, I won't get into the specifics of it, and I don't think they're double counting. It was all very above board, but they've been able to essentially have a good impact on their community and on the school building near them just by being, just by getting to that level of 100% zero energy for the building. I went on a tour and took all those nerdy pictures that people take as building scientists. And so I hope you all appreciate. On the left, we've got all of their composting bins for the waste, for the human waste, because they do that. There is there is no way for this building. All of the they are recycling all of their waste and wastewater. They also have a very cool urine harvesting system in this building that, if any of you are into that stuff, they're taking all of just the pee from the urine, from the urinals into this system that then they built out with some folks in Portland that dehydrates it and turns it into like it's a crystalline form that they then bring out to local farms and use as fertilizer. So it's a very cool thing. On the right side is their microgrid system, which is allowing them to actually stay online and to run all of the systems of the building when the power goes out in Portland. And they've been working with the city of Portland to kind of be a resiliency center, so that if the grid goes down, that folks can come to the building and use the electricity, use the water systems, et cetera, as a form of community resilience. So just a very cool little microgrid there. And it's a beautiful space. It's mass timber, as they tend to be. So you just get this warmth, incredible warmth and beauty from being inside the space. Just really impressive building. There you go. There's one last shot of the solar panels packed into the roof. It's really incredible. So yeah, again, we're just learning from every building, right? A lot of what we're doing here is kicking the tires. We're going to start working on a book pretty soon that sort of, well, I should say we're going to be working on post-occupancy evaluations of a lot of these buildings in a little bit more depth, so that we can tell the stories of what worked and what didn't work for some of these really novel building systems. But also just because I think it's important that folks understand the living buildings are in fact alive, and that they change over time, and certain things, I think there'll be a lot of wonderful stories about how they've been used and what impacts they've had on folks. But also, we just want to use them as teaching tools, as learning laboratories that they are. So this last question that we think about a lot here at the Institute is, how do we go from showing the world that it is possible to build these buildings to becoming scalable? How do we make it such that all buildings can achieve zero energy? I don't actually think these days that we are aiming for buildings to all treat their own waste, but what is it going to take for us to get to scale? Increasingly for me, that looks like, as I've said, using these buildings as tools in their community, but also really using them pretty explicitly for policy change. So we're starting to grow a little bit of our work as an organization to help our colleagues who are focused on the codes world, the building performance standards world, other kinds of aspects of building regulatory systems, to try to incorporate a little bit more of the high bar aspect to those codes, stretch codes, et cetera, reach codes, depending on where you are. So what we're thinking is that the more lessons we can learn from these, and the more examples we have in different parts of the country, especially mostly focus on the US for that work, we're really trying to figure out how to use these buildings to say to policymakers, this is possible, we need to do this everywhere, so that we can kind of achieve that shift, really, because it isn't just about sort of inspiring people to make a good choice. It is about kind of changing the system. I think this might be my last slide here. But it is just a sort of, this is, I think, a quote from our strategic plan that we came out with last year. If you're curious to learn more in depth about kind of where the Institute is as a organization, the kinds of things we're thinking about, this is from our strategic plan, which is on our website. It kind of gets into some of the programs and the ways that we're trying to be a force for good in the community these days. But it is really to go to this point of understanding that everyone deserves and should have access to resilient buildings, to regenerative buildings, and that they are very capable of providing supporting great communities and jobs. So that's kind of what keeps us going these days. I know we've had a few questions in the chat, so I'm gonna look at those, and let me see. I guess there were a couple. Yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing and go to some of these questions. So would most living buildings be considered a microgrid because they are net zero? So yeah, Allison, great question. It's the microgrid itself, that Schneider Electric computer, is allowing the building to actually manage its electricity and loads in such a way that in the event of a power outage, it actually can effectively and safely distribute electricity throughout the building. So in a lot of buildings, well, let's put it this way, because it's a commercial building, it's not just as straightforward as solar plus battery. If you're in a residential building, you can have your solar panel and your battery, and, assuming that regulations are the way they, working in your favor in your jurisdiction, if the power goes off, your solar and your battery are going to talk to each other, and that is a microgrid in that sense, because it's going to take care of your little home. For a commercial building, electricity and all the systems in the building, especially the ones that are pumping the water and such, are not quite that simple. And so you need this other machine that is not just the batteries and the solar in order to kind of get everything someone here might actually be able to explain that a little bit better, but I believe it's a question of actually regulating the amperage of the power, etc. So it's a necessary bit of brain that has to go into the building in order to actually allow it to function off grid. To function off grid in a city with a lot of regulations and a lot of complexities to the power grid and how it works. Yeah, I'm glad you like it. I don't think it's an ugly building, the PAE building. I shouldn't say that. They actually did a really nice job with it. The windows are a golden, what is that called? Golden ratio kind of structure of rectangles. So they're trying to do something to kind of make that really beautiful. YouTube live question: has the Inflation Reduction Act impacted living building work? Great question. It's right now what we're seeing is that a lot of our manufacturers are getting funding to do the things they've always wanted to do with us, to pursue the Living Product Challenge, et cetera, because there was a lot of funding in the IRA for decarbonizing manufacturing. And then we've also seen a pretty big, I would say, bit of excitement at this point in the real estate world around the funding that they're going to be receiving to pursue these kinds of goals. I guess what I would say is that the IRA, it was done well in the sense that it's trying to create some of these incentives. I'm sure you all know about this and are seeing it at Southface, to make it easier for folks to get over that financial hurdle of designing buildings this way. But the proof, I would say, like the actual manifestation of it just isn't happening quite yet. Like it's still, the money's still kind of making their way to people. The other thing that I will say, and I decided to skip these slides about embodied carbon, but the other big change that it has precipitated is that suddenly a lot more real estate owners are caring about embodied carbon. And that has something to do with the buy clean specific components of the IRA. So buy clean meaning buy low embodied carbon building materials. And that, so we've, for example, just started working with the GSA on federal building procurement and on using our zero carbon program to certify GSA buildings. it's just been a huge sort of surge of interest and commitment. So we're now part of a new coalition that is coming together, that we're leading with a couple of other organizations, Architecture 2030, USGBC, Carbon Leadership Forum, and Building Transparency around embodied carbon sort of data, transparency and alignment, sort of nomenclature and systems to sort of make that happen. And I think that all is happening because the IRA has really sort of helped the industry take a stand on the importance of reducing the embodied carbon of all manufacturing, but specifically within the building industry. It's a big deal. So we're seeing that. But I think it's probably the same as you all, we're sort of waiting for the money to actually get to the people so that they can actually build the buildings. And then I think we'll start to see it. I think it's really important and wonderful that we managed to pass climate legislation at the federal level. And certainly that seems to have given an important signal to a lot of the folks that we work with to take these issues seriously and to know that the demands that we are making are not going away. So it feels good. And also, we're not really so much of a policy shop, so we're not as engaged in the day-to-day of the making of the policy or figuring out exactly how all the money gets distributed or anything like that.
Yeah, Lindsay, that you're bringing up a good point, though. If you don't mind having a little more of a conversation, we've had these, we've had federal executive orders for a while. Now we actually do have legislation. That's good. But I can say from my own experience, we still have federal agencies that are not being encouraged or required or incentivized to do anything and with their building stock, anything significant. And, what I would say is that, the Bush administration had their executive orders. The Obama administration's, theirs were even stronger. And we had goals for when our portfolio would, meet a certain amount of energy production on site or, reduction of loads, et cetera. And, we had goals and then they were rolled back during the Trump administration. And some of them have been put back in place, but there's not really an evaluation system in place that's making us, I'm being very transparent. It's not making us do anything differently. So I guess I just wonder, how can we start to, I always look at building codes as the way to start to make this a more universal change. And of course, I think of certifications as, just like you showed, as this step between, where we are and where we'd like to be. Sometimes further than where we'd like, like you're saying, this is a pedagogy, a teaching experience, these buildings, this living building. But yeah, I guess I'm wondering what is the way to get more uptake in these situations when
I will say, and we could go down this road a little bit further, but I really believe that building performance standards are going to be necessary in the future for us as a movement in what we need to be demanding in order to really get to that state that we can all feel confident that buildings are really being built to and then operating at the level of performance that we need from them. And so, local law 97 in New York City is probably one of our best examples. Also the Washington, DC Omnibus Act building performance standards that they have in place and are working on right now. Both of those cities and a handful of others are really doing impressive work right now to make this the case. And while I agree with you that building codes are a critical piece of that, it isn't about long-term performance with a code. And this infrastructure that we're starting to create around building performance standards, I think it's really exciting for a number of reasons. One of the things we're working on with the Institute for Market Transformation, just starting to, is how we're going to start building in some health standards into building performance standards, not just energy.
Good. I'm glad you're saying that. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, it's, of course, that would be your jams. And so, but it is really, there's I guess what it is, and this is where I try to spend a little bit of my time these days, and I think some of you all, maybe you do this, and I'd love to talk to you about it, but I've come to learn that when you look around and you ask yourself the question, who is creating the model policies, the new ideas for how we might introduce these concepts of, carbon neutrality for buildings, healthy buildings, et cetera, into policy at all scales, federal, state, local, private policy, whatever that is, agency policy. There's not a lot of folks thinking outside the box about it. There's a lot of folks saying, okay, let's try to figure out how to build something into the codes that we already have. Let's try to figure out how to take 90.1 and evolve it slightly to do this. That is great, but the idea of a building performance standard is a new type of policy framework that I think has a lot of promise, because it really kind of connects the demand to what we're actually trying. It connects what we need to the building sort of infrastructure around us, and says that it might be okay and it might be necessary for us as a society to start actually saying, no, in order to have a building that is open and that you can sell and that you can rent and that you can lease out in this particular city, it needs to be not poisoning people. It needs to be not a complete energy hog. It needs to be, a good citizen like that we should be,
Right.
Like you got smog checks for cars. We have all of these things where we regulate the ongoing performance of stuff in our society. So I think it's time for us to do that for buildings, and we're going to try to help out however we can with it. Thumbs up for sure on the BPS for Sarasota. That's exciting. I think the sooner we can do it, the better. And I know that there are other folks in this community in Southface that are involved in that. So thank you all for the work. I think it's the future. On that side. Let me see, there's other questions. Does Living Future deal with the rising movement of off the grid, net zero, tiny homes and communities? We do in a sense, but I guess let me put it this way, because I started to realize that some people don't understand this about us recently. We are an organization that is focused on a mission. And that mission is around the global building sector. And our mission really it cascades down from our desire to see a building sector that is culturally just, socially rich, ecologically restorative as fast as we possibly can. So when we build our tactics down from that overall global goal, it means that we are absolutely focused on companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft that we work with, the GSA, et cetera, to get towards those goals faster, because scale is important for us. The rising movement of off the grid, net zero, tiny homes and communities is also a piece of the solution for sure. But I think sometimes people have understood the Living Future Institute as being kind of more of like an exclusive club for like the really cool fringy folks working on the super weird, urine harvesting systems and things. And yes, we're trying to create space for that, and it's a part of who we are. But we are not an exclusive club trying to just represent all of these crazy ideas. We are a mission-driven organization that is ultimately trying to get as many people as we can into this movement and as many buildings as we can to be transformed. And so while we're going to hold that high bar always and try to make sure that everyone understands this is what good looks like, this is what climate-aligned buildings look like, this is what healthy buildings look like, we're not necessarily going to compromise on that definition because it would be false. But nonetheless, that we are trying to get everybody into that bucket, not just the folks that that really like want to build some cob houses and things like that. So that's our understanding of our work.
So Lindsay, I have a question. So tell us about the office of the future. So, remote work, hybrid work, your experience at WeWork. I think the world has fundamentally changed. What's your view of what it begins to look like?
It's fun for me that we thought about a lot of this stuff at WeWork, like what is the innate reason that people want to go into an office, right? Like that was always important to us when we were there. So I felt like I had a little bit of a head start, for better, for worse, when the pandemic hit and people started saying like, actually, I kind of like it. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I'm wearing sweatpants right now, you guys. They're cashmere and they're fantastic. And I was telling my husband the other day, I was like, I think the hardest part for me about going back into an office whenever it happens is that I'm not going to get to wear my cashmere pants whenever I want to. So there are real things here that I think are, we're all learning how to shift what we are allowed to do, sort of what our new lifestyles might provide for us that might be healthy for our brains, healthy for our bodies. Not getting stuck in traffic every morning and every afternoon, getting back and forth from an office job or, any kind of job where you have to commute. So we're rebalancing that. The good news is, I think, for the real estate world, is that humans need shelter, and we need a lot of different kinds of shelter. And that demand is not going to go away. It may be that we need more space that sort of blurs the edges of residential, rather than feeling like these spaces are entirely defined by residential, commercial, industrial, retail, etc. So I think we're going to have a lot of blurred spaces. I think the idea of the future, if I had to say the future of the office, is probably that there is no such thing as an office anymore. But it doesn't mean that people don't come together to work. I imagine that they will do that. And what's more, the things that will make for a good collaborative work environment in the future are the things that we care about. Good air, good light, biophilia, the ability to have diversity of different kinds of spaces that you can work in that are acoustically appropriate. People are going to care so much more about acoustics than they ever did before. And for those of us that are acoustics nerds, that's great news. It means that all of these kinds of things we used to try to work on might actually get some attention. And I think that's great. So it means that I think we're going to need buildings to be more desirable. For me, I'll just say one of my kind of crazy visions of the future that I'm always working on is, what if commercial real estate, what if big buildings were no longer valued because of their sort of abstracted financial asset value? In other words, in sort of international financial markets. And instead they were valued based on how well they did their job, which is to shelter people and to make them comfortable in a collaborative environment with other folks. That would mean a lot of systems being somewhat shifted or disrupted, the ways, in particular around sort of commercial real estate asset valuation. But the possibility is all there. We have the sensors, we have the feedback mechanisms to know, is this a good building or not? Do people actually like being in it or no? And for that to become the valuation mechanism for some of these tall buildings in cities around the world, then you've got owners that are motivated to try to make them lower carbon, better for people's health, and you kind of start to develop the right kind of cycle. So I got a lot of visions in that way, James. I hope that starts to answer your question. But
Lindsay, I love that. And to me, it speaks more to a move away from iconic architecture and more towards process architecture, and all the things Corbu did, he coined this term, a machine for living. And, where it ended up was not exactly, I think, what his vision was, but that's what these things are. These buildings are really about people. And I think moving away from this idea of this building is about the building and the designer, and saying, no, it's about what are we making the canvas for life? What are we making that look like, feel like? What are the performance characteristics? And I'll shout out to acoustics. we are working on projects to improve acoustics in our own buildings, which we would never have like entertained years ago, because people were just like, well, we can't see it. We don't know how to fix it, you know, but now it's being brought to mind. Well, nobody wants to work in that building. No one wants to work. No one reserves those spaces. So,
yeah, totally. I really agree. And I see that Will's comment is actually also kind of along these lines. Like, do you think traditional flows of capital into cities are changing? Yes, all of that. And I think, yes. Oh man, Will, we could talk a lot longer about some of what you're discussing there, because I really do think, I mean, once you start to imagine, again, that buildings are not the financial asset that they have been for the past century, roughly speaking, and they just go back to doing their job well, you know, location is less important than it ever was, for better or for worse. And so the question of what are you going to, you know, base that valuation on changes. The question of the notion of how important landlords are and like how sustainable that is as the system changes. So yeah, it's a exciting, fraught but exciting kind of set of questions. Yeah, Allison, that is one of the things we're actually starting to work on is sort of the idea of policy. We're going to do some documents that are basically policy barriers and opportunities to living buildings for specific places. I'm actually hopeful that we might do one specifically for Atlanta, because I think it would be kind of great to take the examples from the Candida building and ask ourselves, what are the policy barriers? What kinds of incentives or other kinds of policy opportunities could we put in place for Atlanta to make it, to sort of speed up the possibility and the momentum of living buildings, or, you know, almost living buildings in a place like Atlanta. And I'm totally biased having grown up there, but I think it's also a particularly good example of a city that does have a living building that has some significant policy sort of complexity to work through. It might be, you know, relatable to the rest of the country in a way that we're not going to be doing that kind of a study in Seattle or here in the Bay Area.
So Sam gets the last question, and we'll go ahead and conclude.
Hey, Lindsay, we actually have several project teams that we're working with that are pursuing the Living Building Challenge, and you know, one of the biggest impediments, I guess, that we've run into is just sourcing materials. It's complicated working through all the different buckets, I guess. And is in the version 5 Living Building Challenge, are you working on any tools to help streamline material selection regionally or?
You know, regionally, I'm not sure as much as yes, we are working to streamline it significantly in a few different ways. I guess one thing I would say is, again, you know, we're not in the business of lowering the bar. So it is important to us that these materials continue to be showing that they are low embodied carbon, that they are safe from a chemical perspective. But the good news is that there's just such a greater ecosystem of other kinds of tools and nonprofits and things like that. So one of the things we're trying to streamline is shared databases, shared actual sort of interoperability of the databases so that it's easier to select materials, more recognition of sort of like to like. We're probably going to be changing a little bit of our criteria around exactly how much the level of transparency or the number of parts per million you have to have of transparency for some of these materials from a chemical standpoint, so that it's just all kind of cleaned up and aligned, and you're not looking at, you know, 6 different definitions of transparency for product. So yeah, you can look forward to that. I think we still know it's to get the actual certification, it's still the most expensive thing is this vetting of materials. So we're working hard on that for sure.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Lindsay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks for your leadership. Thanks for your vision. We were really happy to have you as a leadership series speaker today at Southface. Thanks for everyone that's on the YouTube and the broadcast and on virtually and in here in the room. We appreciate you so much. We have a brand new Southfacer today, Zach. We'd like to welcome him. You know, this is what Southface is about. It's about being an intern and becoming a CEO of a major international leadership firm. So thank you so much. We look forward to collaborating and working with you in as many ways as possible. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks, everyone.